I first wish to apologize to all those who tumbled out of bed and rushed here this morning to listen to the address of His Eminence, the Secretary of State. I am not that Parolin. We are still trying to reconstruct the nasab. For translators, good luck, nasab. But as you know, in matters of ansab, al-ilm is mostly contingent, discursive, and even wayly. Please allow me to thank the organizers at Pluriel and the hosts at the Pontifical Università Gregoriana and PISAI. This conference is in a way a celebration of a person's strong belief in the necessities and virtues of institutional cooperation. One of Michel's first visits to PISAI happened to take place during my well-cherished annual teaching at the Institute. And here we are, a few years later, with my hair grayer and the second Pluriel conference. Kudos, Michel. It is not a mere exercise in style. This is an extremely valuable opportunity to reflect more broadly and collectively on issues that are at the heart of the vivere comune. And law is a central part of that, as Gustavo Zagrebelski reminded us in his 2009 Intorno alla legge. I will thus try and draw from what we have heard in the past couple of days and what we will hear today to trace some of the past developments and current trends of one of the key articulations of belonging in the world of modern states, citizenship. Belonging operates on a number of levels as, actually I'm going to do the entire thing here, there we go. As Ghalib showed us with reference to socio-anthropological dimensions. Modern states have added, and let me emphasize here, added a further element of complexity to the multiple dimensions of belonging, that of legal/national citizenship. I should have qualified citizenship as legal or national. But the reason why we don't have to is because legal or national citizenship has become the reference point. I will thus keep referring to the legal or national citizenship as citizenship. But I wish to reiterate that this citizenship does not by any means absorb other forms of citizenship. For modern states, citizenship, formerly nationality, is the grammar of belonging. The basics of this grammar are incredibly similar globally. Who is a citizen, who can become one, or how one ceases to be one, are issues regulated by legislation under the rubric of Jinsiyya. The space for individual agency is extremely limited here. Most of its rules do not require or even consider the will of the individual. Citizenship provisions operate ex lege, by operation of the law. I was never asked if I wanted to be a citizen of Italy. I am one simply because I was born of a parent who was. Foreign fighters are stripped of their citizenship because of their participation in terrorist activities, often against their will. Even in cases when one applies to become a citizen or to stop being considered one, it ultimately requires a decision of the state, usually the executive. If I apply to become a British citizen on the basis of my continuous residence in the country to try and avoid some of Brexit's effects on EU citizens, it will be the Home Office who will decide on my application, beyond the sheer fulfillment of statutory requirements. When US citizens sign an oath of renunciation in order to stop being subjected to IRS requirements, for instance, it will be the Department of State that will have to make a decision on their case. These preliminary observations already point us to the centrality of the state and show us a significant degree of alignment with other forms of citizenship where the social body retains control over matters of inclusion and exclusion. It was my argument in the book that this new grammar of Jinsiyya in the region speaks to already deep-rooted understandings of the dynamics of belonging, be they at the level of the religious community or the kin group. In these 2 days, we have not spoken much about the conflicts that inclusion generates, a very delicate issue in all families where parents belong to different groups, be they religious communities or otherwise. But we did hear, for instance, from Hamadi and Dirk about the complexities of exclusion through blasphemy or apostasy in case of Muslim communities. Most legislations in the region do not recognize any effect of apostasy on the citizenship status. The major exception used to be the Libyan law of 1954, which was abrogated in 2010. While both Kuwait and Oman introduced in the late 80s, well, actually in the 80s, not late 80s, apostasy in the case of Kuwait and profession of atheism in the case of Oman as grounds for the deprivation of citizenship for the naturalized. Some actors, however, do invoke blasphemy or apostasy to prompt state authorities to deprive certain citizens from their citizenship, even in the absence of provisions in that sense. Probably the most renowned or well-known case here is the one of Nawal Saadawi in Egypt. A case was filed against the Ministry of Interior for inactivity in not depriving Nawal Saadawi of her Egyptian citizenship because of her columns and her play. God resigns during the summit meeting. Alila yuqaddim istiqalatahu fi ijtima' al-qimma, where the sheer representation of God seemed to be what worried most Al-Azhar. An administrative court ruled in May 2008, however, against Nawal Saadawi's deprivation of citizenship. When states establish the status of an individual as their citizen, what used to be called nationality in English and is still called Jinsiyya in Arabic, this generates a large number of legal consequences in terms of duties, mostly, and rights. This is what I try to capture in this diagram. From the duty to contribute to the fiscal system or to serve in the army, to the right of, for instance, being employed as a civil servant or to participate in the decision-making process, what we generally refer to as political participation. These rights and duties are typically discussed under the rubric citizenship Muwatana. The relatively recent switch in English and most other European languages to the use of citizenship, citoyenneté, cittadinanza, Staatsbürgerschaft, for both the status, originally nationality, nationalité, nationalità, Staatsangehörigkeit, Jinsiyya, and its effects, citizenship, citoyenneté, cittadinanza, Staatsbürgerschaft proper, Muwatana, somehow blurs the distinction between a definition of status safely in the hands of state authorities, and the rights and duties emanating from it, in which the citizen has a significantly wider degree of freedom in deciding how to exercise. Locally embracing Muwatana was not as smooth as the local embracing of Jinsiyya. Not only the content of Muwatana dramatically varies throughout the region, but its true conception assumes very local connotations. This localization of Muwatana needs to be taken seriously. I have, for instance, elsewhere traced the development of the use of Muwatana in Egypt, starting from an issue that was riddling me. Why does citizenship in Egypt evoke only images of religious inequality? Why not questions of political participation, or of gender equality, or of class mobility? In looking for answers, I discovered that the citizenship debate is one of the prime examples of how cultural hegemony has been constructed in Egypt in the past 100 years, and how it has served to keep to the margins some of its undesired components. I suspect we could find other incarnations of these dynamics if we were to look at other cases. The scope of Muwatana in Egypt was significantly narrowed and mutilated in the process of building this hegemonic discourse in a dialogue between organic intellectuals, the ones upon whom the ruling class that emerged with the creation of modern Egypt in the first half of the 19th century relied on to build consensus for the new order, and traditional intellectuals, networks of intellectuals who do not engage with the ruling class and its project, but rather ground their authority in tradition. When it comes to citizenship, both groups resort to Islamicate ideas and discourses. However, traditional intellectuals tend to refer to it as their main frame of reference. I identify three phases in the building of the hegemonic discourse on Muwatana. These phases allow us to appreciate how the positions shifted over time, but this shift should not distract us from the consolidation of consensus over what citizenship meant, a consensus that was taking shape in the background. In the first phase, the counter-hegemonic inception phase, traditional intellectuals started the debate by staging a counter-hegemonic challenge to the organic intellectual and their national ideologies. Over the century, both the local Wataniya and the wider Qawmiya. And we've heard yesterday from El, some of the people involved in this, for instance, Ahmad Lutf Sayyid or Salama Musa. This challenge focused on citizenship because it was perceived as a playing field that was unfavorable to organic intellectuals. Equality irrespective of religious affiliation or citizenship, Muwatana. Traditional intellectuals must have thought it was an element of the nationalist project that could not fly with the wider Egyptian public, and thus counted on widespread consensus against such a principle. And here the major figures are, of course, mostly Hassan al-Banna. The failure of this challenge, so the idea was that the nationalist organic intellectuals would describe or try to describe the new political communities along the lines of nations, Watan, their forms of allegiances, Wataniya, and the engineered forms of loyalty like Muwatana. So against this centrality of Watan and its project, the other responded, no, there's no such thing as a Watan. We do not recognize this lower level of affiliations. The failure of this challenge opened a second, see here I've put just like a few pictures of people that were involved, opened a second phase, the accommodation phase. When traditional intellectuals experimented with forms of accommodation. Now, there were two moments here. First, there was a progressive opening to the idea, first of the regional pan-Arabism. So traditional intellectuals started engaging with the idea, well, you know what, Qawmiyya is actually all right. I'm thinking about Muhammad al-Ghazali here. If, you know, under the Qawmiyya, Islam can actually operate. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for instance, followed the same line. And actually, Yusuf al-Qaradawi himself also moved from the Qawmiyya to the local Wataniyya, saying, you know what, it's actually fine. If we have this lower level of political dimension and community, as long as the system works Islamically, that's fine. There was another main axis of discussion here, which concentrated on the status of Copts. And that is where somehow the hegemony or the hegemonic consensus was crafted. So first was the discussion on the dhimma. Is the dhimma still existent or not? And here we have two different positions. We have a more conservative, conservative, probably the authors themselves wouldn't consider it conservative. But those authors, I recite here Qaradawi, but also Sayyid Qutb, who said the dhimma still exists. But Sayyid Qutb, for instance, read into it a form of equality itself. Then there's another series of authors that say, no, come on, you know, dhimma is gone. It's a thing of the past. But then when it actually comes to the operational rules, they're actually all aligned. For instance, on the jizya, except Sayyid Qutb, who understands jizya as a marker of equality, all the others agree that jizya is a thing of the past. Even Qaradawi, who said, no, the dhimma still exists, said, no, the jizya is something of the past. So there seems to be like a divergence on the dogmatic approach, but a convergence on the operational rules. But then there was another further problem, which was the problem of the wilayat amma, that is, can Copts participate in the higher functions of the state? And that's actually where we see most of the divergences between the traditional intellectuals. And there, the discriminatory factor used to be the sabgha diniyya, that is the religious element in the specific public function, on the basis of which you would exclude or include Copts. One of the effects of this accommodation phase, that is, most traditional intellectuals joined forces with organic intellectuals, was of course the spin-off of the Salafis or jihadists. I mean, not or in terms of as a synonym, but both groups. We've heard from Emmanuel about al-wala wal-bara, and Az-Zawahiri is one of the most well-known references in articulating this discourse that challenges the accommodation between the traditional intellectuals and the organic intellectuals by positioning both al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya wa Jama'at al-Jihad against this consensus by saying, no, sorry, you know, we have strong evidence in the sources. Copts cannot be equals to Muslims. The accommodation was abruptly terminated by a shift to a third phase, the counter-challenge phase, precipitated by the rise of the political rise of Mubarak's son Gamal, who mobilized organic intellectuals through the ruling party machinery to re-engage traditional intellectuals on the same playing field, Muwatana. There were two main moments here. He started this process of, well, you remember that at that time, the Ikhwan were scoring very well in the elections, and that became a major source of concern for the Hizb al-Watan al-Demokrati. And so they had to somehow mobilize a new ideology once the socialist ideology had been retired. And so it all centered around al-Fikr al-Jadid, the new thinking. And citizenship played a central role in that. This actually led to the constitutional amendments of 2005 and 2007, which I will come back to. And here, of course, why was it a counter-challenge? Because, of course, it was very, very popularly known that one of the most famous lines of the Ikhwan, of the Muslim Brotherhood, was that we would rather have a president of the Republic who's an Indonesian Muslim rather than an Egyptian Copt. So they used that, I mean, the Hizb al-Watan al-Demokrati used that to show that these people are speaking nonsense. Why couldn't our neighbor, the Copt, participate in the higher positions of state administration? And we would rather have these Indonesians. And by the way, Indonesians are not a remote, exotic sighting in Egypt because they attend Al-Azhar en masse. So you actually know what they look like. You know they barely speak Arabic. Why would you have one of those, heading your being the president of Egypt while you have a Copt right there? So that's the kind of reasoning that the Hizb al-Watan al-Demokrati put forward to contrast this. And that was the counter-challenge. Beginning in the accommodation phase and continuing through the counter-challenge third phase, the contention between traditional and organic intellectuals seemed to fade, giving way to an overarching consensus on the post-colonial state and its structures of governance. The counter-challenge, which suffered from Gamal Mubarak's personal political successes and defeats, consolidated the hegemonic consensus over what citizenship means in Egypt, allowing it to go through the 2011 uprising and the 2013 coup largely unscathed. At its heart, therefore, the hegemonic discourse fully occupies the public debate on citizenship with issues of religious inequality and thus prevents any meaningful engagement with other key components, for instance, political participation, gender equality, or class mobility. Both traditional and organic intellectuals contributed to this hegemonic consensus, emergence and perpetuation, with the former showing a remarkable ability to work within Islam's texts and traditions and thereby clothed in proper Islamic garments. Traditional intellectuals' participation in constructing the hegemonic consensus simultaneously constrains their ability to engage with religious inequality and wider citizenship issues in Islam's texts and traditions. In terms of the former, for instance, the status of non-Muslim citizens who do not belong to the canonical category of people of the book is left hanging or is at best discussed on the margins. Beyond the conventional equality core, traditional intellectuals do not explore nor engage with other wider aspects of citizenship, such as the scope for Muslim citizens' participation in decision-making in the overall governance structure, how to address gender disparities, or rethink rigidities in class mobility. Even if traditional intellectuals think they are providing a counter-hegemonic discourse, as might have been the case during the first phase, in reality they are helping to construct a hegemonic consensus that holds down even their own potential. So far, I have confined our gaze to past developments. But how do they affect our present? And are there current trends that we can identify? The constitutional politics of citizenship could be a good vantage point, especially after the post-2011 round of constitutional amendments or altogether new constitutions in the region. Yeah. So that refers to the title of the general title, the Jinsiyya obsession and the Muwatana veil. First, a caveat on constitutions. Just as the subaltern challenges the constraints of a citizenship they are denied access to, constitutions are intent on re-challenging political participation in the bed of formal politics, and entrenching even further the hegemonic reading of legal and social change. As I have argued elsewhere, revolution and constitutional change have been deliberately associated to instill the belief of a hand-in-glove relationship between the two. The radical change sought with revolutions, however, has very little chance of being attained in constitutional processes imbued with liberal legality, especially when these come to be controlled by forces pursuing continuity rather than change. North Africa offers a set of examples of how the processes of constitutional change can be designed to keep at the margin, keep radical forces and ideas away from the drafting table. Drafters, in turn, make sure to entrench their positions and further sideline the marginalized. Constitutional failure, then, might not be bad news for the revolutionaries. If this is indeed the context, how can we read the increasing references to citizenship, both Jinsiyya and Muwatana, in constitutions? References to citizenship in constitutional texts have multiplied over the past couple of decades globally. And legal systems that use Arabic as their official language are no exception. One could group these new citizenship provisions in three blocks. One, provisions on Jinsiyya regulations, in line with the liberal trend that prefers to set such regulations at the constitutional level to try and avoid the legislator's whims on such momentous decisions on membership in the political community. Two, provisions involving single Jinsiyya requirements to hold public office, counter to the liberal tendency to reduce them. And three, provisions emphasizing Muwatana as the mode of the political system, in line with the liberal emphasis on the participation of citizens in decision-making. Now, the Jinsiyya obsession. First, locking Jinsiyya. Even at a quick glance, the increase in Jinsiyya regulations in constitutional text jumps out. And it has generally been enthusiastically welcomed as a move away from executive arbitrariness. So we put it in the Constitution, the executives no longer have their say, we're all better guaranteed. But has placing Jinsiyya regulations in constitutions affected the way state authorities operate, though? I argue that executive practice seems to show the opposite, and I refer here to two cases which I have looked a bit into after 2011. The first is a case of a policy shift in the application of the Egyptian citizenship law to children born in Egypt of Egyptian mothers and Palestinian fathers. The second is a practice of generous grants of citizenship beyond the statutory text and the statutory expansion of the grounds for stripping Bahraini citizens of their citizenship. So the first case, the Egyptian case. Arab state authorities have quite consistently refused to grant citizenship to Palestinians or their offspring in a move to allegedly protect Palestinian identity from vanishing with full integration in the host countries, often against the letter of their own domestic legislation. And this practice is the well-known policy of Rafd al-Tawti. Egypt was no exception. Children born in Egypt of Egyptian mothers and stateless or unknown fathers were deprived of their right to be Egyptian citizens if their fathers were Palestinians, against the letter of Article 2 of the 1975 law that provided citizenship acquisition by a combination of ius soli and maternal ius sanguinis, if the father was stateless or unknown. So they played with the category of statelessness, and courts would play with the category of statelessness and say, Palestinians are not stateless, they're Palestinians, therefore we cannot apply Article 2. The problem came in 2004 when an amendment to the 1975 law brought maternal ius sanguinis on a par with paternal ius sanguinis. So sheer birth of an Egyptian mother made one an Egyptian citizen. A transitional provision allowed children of an Egyptian mother born before the coming into force of the law to notify the Ministry of Interior of their intention to acquire Egyptian citizenship. And the minister had then 1 year from the date of notification to refuse. It wasn't until, so 2004, it wasn't until after 2011, however, that children of Palestinian fathers and Egyptian mothers born before the coming into force of the 2004 law started being granted Egyptian citizenship. Monthly decisions by the Ministry of Interior carried increasing numbers of naturalizations of this kind since July 2011. And we're talking in the hundreds here. If we take a closer look, however, we find a surprising element. The legal basis invoked for such acquisitions of Egyptian citizenship. The tables that come with the decrees show that most of those who are granted citizenship were born in Egypt. As such, they should be Egyptian citizens by birth, as per Article 2 of the 1975 law, that is ex lege, by operation of the law. No executive discretion involved. However, these children of Egyptian mothers born in Egypt were granted Egyptian citizenship on the basis of Article 3 of the 2004 law. According to the 2004 law, they had 1 year to notify not to apply to the Ministry of Interior, and the Ministry of Interior had 1 year from the notification to refuse the grant. But not only mid-2011 was well past the deadline of 1 year after 2004, but also state authorities retained administrative discretion in the granting. So here we see a case of a liberal change in policy that has that was not grounded in any statutory change. The second case, Bahrain. Since its first independent constitution in 1973, Bahrain had a constitutional provision on citizenship. The provision was strengthened in 2002 and left untouched in 2012 after the constitutional amendments that followed the uprising. In the case of Bahrain, we observe two phenomena in the executive discretion that are arguably at odds with the constitutional provision. The first is, as I said, these generous grants of citizenship to change the demographic and tip electoral battles. And we are very well aware, considering also the current debate in Lebanon, this is not just like a case of Bahrain. It's quite popular elsewhere as well. And second, an expansion of the grounds for withdrawal of Bahraini citizenship in legislation. Now, Based on personal allegations and speculations on census figures, the opposition claims that in the last 20 years, the government has pursued a reckless plan to hand out tens of thousands of passports and voting rights to individuals perceived as loyal, be they, well, most of them are members of a Dawsari kin group, mostly residing across the causeway in Saudi Arabia, or what Sunni workforce in the country. More recently, after the 2011 uprising, state authorities have started to withdraw Bahraini citizenship from individuals perceived as unloyal or disloyal to the regime, including former MPs. Grounds for withdrawal of Bahraini citizenship were expanded by a law decree of 2013 on counter-terrorism. There were already grounds for withdrawal of citizenship in the 1963 law, but the new Counter-Terrorism Act criminalized a very broad series of conducts, including conducts that can also be very broadly constructed. And I'm just going to give you one example. Article 6, paragraph 1, which includes creating a group calling for the suspension of the Constitution or of the laws, or preventing public institutions or state authorities from performing their activities, or violating a citizen's individual freedom or other rights and freedoms, or endangering national unity. Now, this is, of course, a description of what happened in Bahrain since 2011. In the face of more stringent provisions, even in constitutions, we witness an increase in the executive discretion, so the opposite of what was meant. So the second form of Jinsiyya obsession, the single Jinsiyya requirement for public office. The second phenomenon has been the introduction of this single Jinsiyya requirements. That is, you can only have the citizenship of the state if you want to run for higher positions in the administration. The case has been particularly divisive in Egypt because it was first introduced by a committee tasked to lower the requirements to run for president, not the opposite. Moreover, the provision was repeatedly invoked to successfully prevent candidates from running. Just after Mubarak's resignation in 2011, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces tasked a committee to amend a few provisions of the 1971 Constitution along the lines of what Mubarak had promised in his last televised speech. That is, fundamentally, to allow more people to put their names on the ballot for the presidency, which was, of course, severely reduced by the 2005 and 2007, especially amendments earlier. What was surprising, so if you actually look at this Article 76, it's very puzzling because in the 1971 Constitution, it used to be like a 1.5-page article, which basically made it impossible to anyone except Gamal Mubarak to actually have their name on the ballot. So now they tasked this committee to draft amendments to this Article 76, and instead of cutting down on these provisions, yes, the provision was severely reduced, but then they added new requirements, including this single citizenship provision. They proposed the first text, with a requirement that the candidate be an Egyptian citizen born of Egyptian parents, both of them, and the further requirement that the candidate and his parents never to have acquired foreign citizenship, thereby excluding also those who have renounced the previously acquired foreign citizenship. Ever since the announcement of the text, analysts tried to identify the high-profile figures that were targeted by such an amendment, for instance, Zuwail or Al-Baradei or Ghunaym. The committee tried to dismiss criticism by drawing analogies with other positions to which the toughened requirement apply in Egyptian law, chiefly in the diplomatic body. When Egyptian voters entered the polling stations, however, they found a different text of the proposed amendment. Nevertheless, the amendments passed with an overwhelming majority of 77%. Now, the approved text of Article 75 then required the presidential candidate and his parents never to have carried a foreign citizenship and not to be married to a non-Egyptian. Two significant changes, the degendering and the formerly dual citizen. The first, in the previously released text, the proposed amendment was gendered. The candidate president could not be married to a non-Egyptian. Woman, because of the feminine in the Arabic version. Surreptitiously marking the presidency as a male-only office. With apparently wide support, considering the public debate that followed, and also the reaction of my law students at Cairo University. Apparently that they were taught before the amendments that the Egyptian constitution reserved the presidency to male Egyptians, simply because the citizenship requirement was said the candidate had to be Egyptian in the masculine. I spent endless time and energy trying to legally deconstruct this nonsensical argument, including traffic laws. It's like, if it tells you to stop at the red light in the masculine, do you go through just because you're a female citizen? No hope. I even consider resorting to Quranic interpretation. Are women not obliged to pray just because the obligation is articulated in the masculine? No hope. The new text voted on reads, married to a non-Egyptian in the masculine, غير مصري. So we have two options here, which I offered my students to their dismay. Egypt is either heading toward a presidency that is open to females, or they're accepting same-sex marriages. The second, I will just go very briefly on this because it's a bit, it is very technical. There has been a change from قد حصل to قد حمل. Has the candidate ever had a foreign citizen, or did it just get it? So, for instance, the case, of course, is someone who was considered to be a citizen by a foreign state and renounced that citizenship. Would this person be allowed to run for president or not? So this momentous distinction, which would rule out one candidate or the other, was surreptitiously introduced in the text that was presented at the voters in the ballot box, not even before in the public discussion. How was the provision enforced? I think that the most famous case is the case of Abu Ismail, who was the front runner of the Islamists, who actually seemed to have a very wide support, and he was ruled out on the basis of this double citizenship problem because of his mother, and that actually generated demonstrations in front of the Presidential Elections Commission, which then led to the Abbasiyya riots that resulted in at least 9 deaths and several hundreds injured. Now, the Muwatana veil. There you go. And here I will mostly summarize. I told you that in the third phase of the the counter-challenge by Gamal Mubarak and the ruling party in Egypt, that process actually translated into enshrining in the constitution the language of citizenship in a very, very prominent status. That is Article 1. Article 1, most of us probably know that if we ever heard anything about the Egyptian constitution, it's usually about Article 2, which describes Islam as the religion of the state or the principles of Islamic law as the main source of legislation. Okay? This is Article 1. It comes even before Article 2. Article 1 was in the 1971 text drafted along the ideological lines of state socialism, which was the ideology of the regime back then. So said that the system of Egypt had a democratic system based on the alliance of the working forces. Now, in 2007, that was removed, and they said, oh, we are taking out this obsolete socialist provisions, and they introduced this phrase, which is the first time that it actually appeared in the constitutional text in the region, that Egypt is a democratic system based on citizenship. So Muwatana there appears in a very, very prominent position. Now, if you then want to read the paper, I actually deconstruct the argument of the simple terminology shift. It's not just about terminology shift. It was there. What did citizenship mean? It was unclear already in 2007. There was, Allah yarhamu, an old MP who actually raised his hand and was like, Yani, it's like, what does it mean, this citizenship? And actually, we see this debate re-emerging even after 2011, when in the Ikhwan Salafi constitution of 2012, the citizenship was, let's say, explained or articulated. They said citizenship, which means equality among citizens. So a strong equality element to it. So in 2014 is the only moment of the law of citizenship in the Constitution. But then, of course, with the suspension of the Constitution in 2013, Muwatana came back to the forefront, and it's still in the 2014 current Constitution at the heart. So it describes the core of the democratic system in Egypt. Again, what it means, its fuzziness, it's largely unaddressed. In the new constitution, that is the 2014, where the Islamist bloc was heavily underrepresented, it reverted to the 1971 text, but added, as amended in 2007, but it added a further element, that is, the democratic system is based on citizenship, muwatana, and the rule of law, siyadat al-qanun. And the explanatory clause of 2012 was taken out. Second constitution, Morocco. Morocco here I qualified as inter alia because it's not really prominent, but it's among the key descriptions of what the Moroccan system is. Here we find, and I'm just going to read you the provision here, it says the constitutional system of the kingdom is based on separation of powers, their balance and cooperation, the participatory citizen democracy, الديمقراطية المواطنة التشاركية, the principles of good governance, and combining responsibility with accountability. So you see that there's a number of elements here, not just the emphasis on citizenship that we saw in Egypt, but yet citizenship features. but it features in a very strange form. الديمقراطية المواطنة التشاركية. That is the use of the active participle as an adjective to demokratiya, which is unusual in modern standard Arabic, but of course points us to the fact that this is a clear reference to la démocratie citoyenne, or citizen democracy, in other European languages. But it also tells us that the debate in Morocco was somehow disconnected from the debate in Egypt. And here is, where I think that we should take this globalization seriously. The debates do not necessarily, engage with each other. And we also know that at the heart of the constitutional changes in Morocco weren't really issues of religious inequality, but was rather the participation of citizens in a form of meaningful, accountable government in the relationship between the crown and an elected parliament. So the reference here to citizenship is probably speaking to that rather than issues of religious inequality as in Egypt. And of course, in the amended or new text of the Constitution, we see this very ingenious new form of government that has these two executives, one chaired by the king and the other not chaired by the king, and that's actually pretty entertaining on its own. I actually call it a form of semi-presidential monarchical system, because that's the model that they espouse, yet they retain the monarchical structure. Tunisia is the third example here, and very briefly, citizenship. You know that different drafts were debated in the Tunisian process, and Muwatana was never really at the heart of these discussions. It appeared in the preamble, but it appeared in very ancillary elements of the preamble. And then it was there, but nobody really cared about it. They discussed a lot the sustain for the liberation of Palestine, for instance, in the preamble and all of that, or other issues of gender equality. You probably remember this debate. But citizenship wasn't really a big thing. But then you probably also remember that the Tunisian process entered a deadlock. There was a moment in which we weren't actually sure whether we would actually end up, the process would actually end up with a text that would carry the agreement or the consensus of all the parties. And now what is striking is that Muwatana comes in, citizenship comes in that draft that overcame the deadlock between the forces. And again, it's a very similar provision to the provision of Egypt. And of course, Tunisia has no particular, tradition of debate like the Egyptian debate or on religious inequality in those terms as the Egyptian debate had. Yet the structure of the provision is very, very similar. So it reads that Tunisia is a civil state, Dawla Madaniya, which of course was also highly debated in Egypt, based on citizenship, al-Muwatana, the will of the people, iradat al-sha'b, and the supremacy of law, ulawiyat al-qanun. Now, of course, this also marks the fact that the debate is local, because ulawiyat al-qanun makes sense in Tunisia, wouldn't make sense in Egypt, where we would call it siyadat al-qanun, just as we heard in the Article 1. So this, again, was the thing. So if after 2011, Muwatana has come to the forefront, and I'm not talking here about the Libyan draft. The Libyan draft was approved in July 2017. It has not yet come into force. This is why I'm not talking about it. But in that case as well, Muwatana has a very, very prominent position. So how are we to construe this text? We know that we haven't had any actual rulings from constitutional courts that invoke this principle of citizenship in a very substantial way. We have not seen ways in which the principle of citizenship has been significantly implemented so far. So a basic construction seems to suggest that citizenship mainly conveys the idea of equality. If we go as far back as the debate in the Egyptian parliament in 2007, which I referred to, or to the translation into vernacular Tunisian of the Tunisian constitution, we find a simplified notion of equality. In the first case, the rejected clarification would have added, which means full equality, al-musawa al-kamila, among citizens, irrespective of gender, religion, or social class. And in the second case, the translation into vernacular reads, which means that all the people in it are equal, kif kif. So actually, it's a very interesting exercise that they did to translate the Tunisian constitution into colloquial Tunisian. The Moroccan text, by associating citizen to participatory as adjectives to democracy, points to a more complex understanding of citizenship, whereby the reference to political participation immediately projects citizenship back at the center of political liberal theory. The Egyptian and the Tunisian texts widely employ and parade other concepts of political liberalism as well. Are we then to assume that citizenship just signals the embracing of political liberalism and neatly encapsulates it? And what about the economic neoliberalism? Does citizenship operate as a proxy also for its liberalizations and free market policies? Will it be used to oppose any redistributive policy? During the still brief enforcement, as I told you, we have had a non-enforcement of the citizenship provisions. To conclude, I've tried to read the increase in Jinsiyya and Muwatana provisions in the region's post-2011 constitutional texts in light of the enforcement that these provisions have seen in recent years. The two trends that seem to be in line with the liberal trend, 1 and 3, are contradicted by executive practices and by the very governance design, while the counter-trend, the second, has been heavily profited from. The second is the single Jinsiyya provisions. How can we thus read these developments? As I told you before, I still strongly believe that the 2011 constitutions have been drafted to constrain the revolutions, to work against these revolutions. One can appreciate the magnitude of the phenomenon just by observing the constitution-making process and how it was captured in various contexts by certain political elites. The low turnout figures in recent elections across the region seem to suggest that voters do not intend to legitimate such machinations with their participation in elections that are fair to international standards but fail to fulfill the promise of representative and accountable government. There are thus constraints and opportunities at play. The constraints seem to be quite clear. Chiefly, an authoritarian construction of constitutions and their provisions, and 2, a hegemonic reading of what citizenship means, that is, a neoliberal formal equality, religious or otherwise. The current attempts to rebrand fiqh al-aqalliyat as fiqh al-muwatana send a sombering message. Citizenship is a form of minority status that affects Muslims only when they become minorities in non-Muslim majority contexts. I'm thinking here of some of the contributions that we've heard. The opportunities seem to lay in the faults of the constraints. Since citizenship now has such an enhanced constitutional status, one could envisage a reclaim operation, where citizenship Muwatana is appropriated and used in its full scope, including, for instance, issues of political participation, gender equality, or class mobility, starting by Muslim citizens. Traditional intellectuals have so far mobilized Islam's texts and traditions mostly to contribute to the hegemonic reading in an authoritarian sense. It's time to reclaim Muwatana. Thank you.